только ради них.
Yeah, okay, so let's get started. The course in English. It's strange to give lectures in English to the depository where everybody speaks Russian, but so are the rules. So I have slides for which are called operations research. This used to be a separate course. So when I just entered high school of economics, this was a separate course for third and fourth module, and some time after, the administration decided to join two courses, the operations research and game theory. It's a bit strange decision because the courses are very different, but I have not, I still believe that logically those are two different classes, two different courses, and they will be graded separately with slightly different approaches. The approach for getting the final grade I will present in the last slide of this presentation. So let me start with a few words about me. So I graduated from Moscow State University, the Computational Mathematics and Cybernetics department. There was time it was a specialist program, and I think it's no specialist programs there. Then after this, I did the postgraduate program, which I finished after 3 years. But the PhD defense was a bit later, 2018. Now, usually people complete their PhD thesis by the end of postgraduate program. This happens when they do nothing else usually, except for the PhD defense. But I did a lot of other things, so after I completed Moscow State University specialist program, I entered the New Economic School. So this NES here abbreviation is not an independent entertainment system, but it's a New Economic School. So in Russian it's Russian Economic School, but they somehow managed to translate the adjective Russian in English as to new. So in English it's New Economic School. And then after New Economic School I started my job in company Исследование. I'm sure nobody knows what this company is. Although it has some department here in Higher School of Economics, but not on this faculty. So I did various things related to mathematical modeling. There were very different projects, so I think it's the only way to describe in one phrase what I did in this. Then I entered SAIS Institute. This company you probably know because there is a department, SAS holds in the Faculty of Computer Science, and they hold a course Data Analysis and Business. So there I worked, started as a consultant, then when I quit SAS I was in a position Senior Customer Advisory. Well, this is pre-sales actually work. Some new management in SAS decided that pre-sales doesn't sound very well, so they said that let's call pre-sale people as a customer advisory, but the activity didn't change. Like police and so there as a pre-sale I worked in supporting sales in machine learning software. So the major product for me was visual data mining and machine learning, which you might have heard if you visited the courses from SAS. Then after my PhD defense, Ford Tadeusz, who was one of my opponents there, invited me to Higher School of Economics. Initially I was part of Faculty of Economic Sciences, but now I'm part of Faculty of Computer Science. And after SAS I went to a different company which is called Polymatica, where I support machine learning software development, and I also had the data science projects when they appear for us. So that's it for me. Now let's get to the introduction to the topic. So this will be introductory lecture, and we'll try to understand what is operations research. Now there are a lot of definitions in various dictionaries. As kind of joke, I translated the definition from Soviet Encyclopedic Dictionary, which says that operations research is applied field of cybernetics. So people in Soviet Union loved this word cybernetics, which used for solving organizational problems. And well, if you drop this cybernetics, so it's not very clear definition. If you drop the word cybernetics, then actually this just captures the main idea that operations research is a field for solving usually organizational or some management problems. So when you see the examples of the problems which we're going to consider, they all may be said that those are some organizational problems, like you want to determine how to distribute resources, how to manage inventory, how to deliver different stuff to different sales points, how to determine the optimal production plans. So those are indeed organizational problems. So I have my own simple definition that operations research is stuff for building and research mathematical models for making optimal decisions. Now this correlates with this definition because usually organizational problems, they are related to some decisions. So we have some manager who has to make some decisions on how to do the business. By the way, my English clear, you understand? Okay. Sometimes I can speak very fast. Okay, so since I mentioned that it's for making optimal decisions, now let's talk about what is meant to say if we have a decision-making problem. So decision-making problem consists of three parts. The first one is the decision alternatives, so what can we in general do. Then there are some constraints which limit the set of possible alternatives. And then because we are talking about optimal decisions, so we need to somehow quantify the different alternatives. And we do this with specifying objective criteria. So objective criterion transforms your decision alternative to a certain numeric value, and then you can compare the decision alternatives. And the first applications, the word applications for finding, determining optimal usage for resources during the Second World War. And well, the wars happened before the Second World War, like it was the wars for the First World War. But the main difference here in these applications is that people, so you see here, you see that the people who started to think of this in the Second World War were the scientists. Now, before these operations research ideas, people usually solved those organizational problems, military, etc., just by experience. So there were some military generals who knew how to do the best. And what was different here is that people started to apply some scientific approach instead of some life experience. Okay, so let's consider some simple examples. So suppose we have a person who needs to travel from A to B 5 weeks in a sequence. And if we open the tableau, the flights tableau, then we see that the flights from A to B occur only on Mondays, and flights from B to A occur only on Wednesdays. And there is a flights price list. Now usually it may depend on the number of weeks, but here we use simplifications. We assume that it doesn't depend on the weeks directly. Rather, there are some pricing rules. So the regular round trip from A to B or from B to A costs $400. The regular round trip, which means that you buy a bundle A to B and B to A as a single bundle. So such round trip, if this round trip is spent over a weekend, then it costs you $320. Okay. So this first point This first point is for round trips. So when you buy a bundle, then the second rule is for a bound with additional constraint that this flights they spend over a weekend. So you fly from A to B on one week, and you fly backwards from B to A on the next week, at least at the next week. So it covers the weekend. If you do it like this, then you get additional discount, and you may buy a one-way ticket in either direction, and it will cost you $300. So we see that if you need to buy a round trip, then it's better to buy a single bundle instead of buying two one-way tickets. And it's of course better to buy round trips such that they span over a weekend. And the question is how to buy the tickets. So the person needs to buy some flight bundles such that he will be able to travel 5 weeks in a sequence from A to B on Mondays and from B to A on Wednesdays. And the question is how to buy the tickets. So we may depict this schematically. So schematically, we may consider the different flights from A to B or from B to A as these points. We have points. And so say this is for week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this corresponds to flights from A to B, which occur on Mondays. And here you now see why I tend to prepare slides this way, because it's a bit difficult to understand what is happening. So these points correspond to the backward flights from B to A, which occurs on Wednesdays. And the person needs basically to cover all these points using the different price bundles. So the person may choose, for example, maybe good alternatives. Yeah, okay, so we consider 3 alternatives. The first is to buy 5 regular round trips AB, BA. This corresponds to coverage values. So you buy 5 bundles, and you manage to cover all the points with such coverages. The next alternative is to buy one A to B, which will so A to B this, then 4 round trips BAB which cover the weekend. So BA here and AB here. And then we have the last point we need to cover, and we cover it with the one-way ticket. And the third alternative is the most tricky. So we keep these 4 untouched, but these 2 points, before they were bought as single one-way tickets, but we may buy them as a bundle. One round trip bundle ABA, but AB starts here, and then BA is here. Okay, and the green are the same. So for these 2 are the same for this third decision alternative. So you may imagine that this trick probably give us the cheapest way, because we cover all the points here, and we cover them with the cheapest bundles we can have this pricing situation. So now let's continue our examples. So the objective here would be to minimize the cost of tickets. In general, it may be different objectives. Say a person might have chosen to skip some of the flights if there is such option, but for this particular problem there is no such option. So the person must cover all the 10 points. So the only objective we may consider here is to how to do this with at the lowest price. Let's do the assessment of the alternatives. The first alternative gives us 5 regular round trips. The alternative and this gives us $2,000. The second alternative will give us 4 times 320. This is the price of the round trip which spends over the weekends. We have 4 bundles which spends over the weekends, and we buy 2 one-way tickets. And this gives us $1,880 cost. And the third alternative, which looks the most tricky one, is just we get 5 round trips spanning over the weekends, so which gives us $1,600 in costs. And by examining this, we may say that alternative 3 is kind of optimal. I put here kind of, I do this because, well, in general, this approach does not allow us to, by itself, it doesn't allow us to prove that we found the optimal solution. So we just considered 3 alternatives. You may imagine that there are many other general alternatives of how to cover those 10 points with this type of coverage. And here we might just use some logics that, well, we covered all the points with the cheapest bundles. So this additional logic, which is very specific to the current pricing, it's kind of proves indeed that it's optimal, so it can't do better. But imagine a more realistic situation where you have different, more complex. More complicated pricing, where, for example, the price of these bundles may depend on the weeks. So the price of this might not be so cheap, so it may be very high. There may be some discounts for one-way tickets here and here, and this more general pricing rules will make this solution technique not so. It may become not so optimal. So in general, it may require you to cover all the possible coverages, and the number of such coverages is pretty large. And of course, if you increase the number of weeks, then this problem will get even more difficult and complicated. And that is why this strategy, that is why I put here kind of optimal. Although for this particular pricing rules, it is indeed optimal. Now let's consider a different problem, which is the problem of selecting area for a garden. So because of irrigation needs, the garden must be of rectangular shape. Now this is justified if you have seen how people do irrigation. Irrigation, is putting water on the field. So irrigation is usually done with some devices which looks like this. Speed test vector. Wheels. So this moving bar, and here you provide water input, and it has this bar from which it sprinkles the water. So this device, this stuff moves here and here, and so when it moves in either direction, it will cover some rectangular shape, right? So it doesn't it's not very easy to cover, for example, a circle with this stuff. It's much easier to cover some rectangular shape. So that is why this irrigation needs may justify that the garden must be of rectangular shape. If of course we are talking about very large garden. If it's a very small garden, well, we can go with a sprinkling, with a small portable sprinkling. It doesn't matter what will be the shape of the area. Now there are other needs. We need to protect against animals and sometimes humans as well. So the garden must be fenced. And we assume that there is a resource constraint, so there is some limit on the materials which may be used to produce the fence. And the resource constraint is such that the maximum length which we can have here is given by L, which is 100 feet for this particular example. So the question is how to fence the garden. Now, because the shape of the garden is rectangular, and in order to specify rectangular, you need to specify width and height of the rectangle, so two levels. Alternatives, as for alternatives, we may start to consider any real values for W and H. So this is the set of alternatives, and then we will put some constraints. The first constraint is as well. The first constraint is the resource constraint, so you may have put very, very large numbers for W and H here, and then the perimeter of this rectangular may become higher than the total length, the maximum length of fence you can build. So you have to put the constraint that the total perimeter of the garden is no greater than this L, the maximum length of fence you can have. And then there are common sense constraints that those variables cannot take negative values. In the objective, so the gardener would like to maximize the area, so the area for rectangular is W times H, so this is our objective function. Now we may try to apply the approach similar to the one we tried to use before, so we just consider some alternatives, just like before. So we consider 5 alternatives, 5 different pairs of values for width and height, and we evaluate them with the objective function, the area of the rectangle. So we see from this exploration that this solution is kind of optimal. Again, the same reason for kind of optimal, because well, we haven't covered all the possible alternatives, right? So here we can guess that this should be probably the optimal, but this analysis by itself doesn't provide us the optimal solution. So we can prove that the solution is optimal. Now let's apply a scientific approach. So it's very easy, unlike for the previous problem. So formally we have such this maximization problem. WH goes to maximum subject to 2 sets of constraints. Now let's solve it. I'm not sure if you have covered the techniques for how to solve the constraint optimization problems with the inequalities. Probably you will have it in this module. But here we may just apply some intuition, which tells us that in optimal solution this constraint will be held as equality. So you may just transform it to equality constraint. Well, because the objective is monotonically increasing in both variables, so of course in optimum you will have this equality as this inequality constraint satisfied as equality. Then if we change it to equality, we may express one variable in terms of another variable. So here we express W in terms of H, and it may look obvious that now we can drop W completely, but no, we have to take into account the constraint on the W variable, which will now translate to the constraint on the single independent variable which are left in this optimization. So this constraint tells us that the H should be no greater than L divided by 2. Then we put it to objective function and use calculus in school experience, the quadratic equation, you find the optimal solution. And you see that this optimal solution for a constraint problem, it satisfies the constraints, so it is an optimal for original constraint problem, and we get our optimal solution. So this simple example just illustrates the main difference, right? So before you might have, before you applied some non-scientific approach, like just consider some alternatives and choose the best among them. Well, might have, of course, said that, well, probably square is some specific form of rectangular, maybe we have to always consider these among our alternatives. But this approach, which is presented in this slide, this is a scientific approach, right? So you have now mathematical theory which tells you that this solution is indeed optimal. So you don't need to think whether it's optimal or not. No, it is optimal because mathematical theorems tell you so. Now, just a bit kind of side note, what if we decided to remove requirement for rectangular shape? Then we have a more general problem, which is to find the shape of a cardinal field which has the greatest area. In order to specify arbitrary shape, the shape is a closed curve without intersections, and the curve is given by a set of, if it's a curve in a two-dimensional space, then the curve is just a pair of functions of a single real valued argument, x of t, y of t, where t goes from 0 to some value big T, capital T. The curve must be closed, which gives us a set of constraints on this function, so the point at which the curve starts is the same as the point at which the curve ends. Then we may use some calculus techniques to calculate the length of the curve, and the area of the curve also is given by this expression, which should be known from the calculus class. And then we have our optimization problem. We maximize the area subject to this is the resource constraint, and the length of the curve is no greater than capital L, and the curve is closed. And if we ask ourselves what are the variables here, well, the variables are x of t and y of t. So the two functions, and these two functions imply a single function may be treated as an infinite number of variables. So here we have just two functions, which means that we have infinite number of variables. I won't consider how to solve this. This is a different topic in optimization theory, which is called the calculus of variations. So there are some techniques which allows you to solve such type of problems.
I have a question.
Yes.
In your picture, we have a rectangle without one line, but in your presentation, we have a rectangle and calculate perimeter with two lines.
When you consider the perimeter,
In your picture, we don't have rectangle.
In what picture?
Here? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this picture just illustrates why when I say that we have irrigation needs, why the irrigation needs initially force us to consider rectangular shape in the first example.
Mm.
But if we decide to, for whatever reason, ignore, so maybe we will use a different tool for irrigate, and then we can drop this requirement of rectangular shape. But when we drop it, we see that we come actually to a very different problem. So this problem for the rectangular, you may solve it using school mathematics, while these calculus of variations problems, well, I'm not sure if the calculus of variations are studied in schools. So this is a much more complicated technique. So it's just an illustration that when you drop some constraints, some requirements, you actually may end up in a different class of optimization problem, which may be much harder than the starting point. Have you studied the calculus of variations?
Yeah. Фрикционные.
Какие?
Фрикционные.
Вариации.
Вариационные. Я услышал фрикционные. Я услышал фрикционные. Нет, вроде нас не было.
Okay, so just a side note, so the optimal solution to this problem will be a circle. So if you apply the advanced calculus of relation techniques, the solution will be a circle, and there is this problem is called Dido problem, задача Dido in Russian. So Dido was a princess in ancient world who escaped her city of birth, and she went to a coast where she wanted to build a new city, and there were some people who there were some people who owned this coast, and she managed to come to agreement with them that they will allow her to choose any field, to take any field as a place for a city, which she can cover with the kind of rope. They gave her the rope of fixed length, and they say you may bound any area which you want, and we will give it to you as a place for your city. And she drew a circle, so she get the greatest area from these people. And this is how the city of Carthage, Carthage in Russian, was founded. And this is a beautiful legend. So of course, when I'm not sure if Dido knew the calculus of variations, because I think the calculus of variations appeared in Newton and Leibniz research. But just using some intuition, she managed to find that the optimal form should be a circle. So indeed, circle gives us the greatest area if we fix the perimeter of the area. Okay, so to generalize these examples, we may say that the general operations research problem consists of the following parts. We need to maximize type here or minimize some objective function. The objective functions in terms of decision variables or more general functions, but we will not consider functions, but in case of only variables, a finite number of variables. Subject to some constraints, again expressed in terms of the decision variables. Now some terminology which may be not so common. We say that if we have some arbitrary assignment for the decision variables, this assignment is called a solution. Now, if this solution satisfies all the constraints, then the solution is called feasible. And then the solution is optimal if it is feasible and it gives the best value, minimum and maximum, depending on what you want to do with the objective function, among all the feasible solutions. And suboptimal solution is a feasible solution that is not optimal. Okay, so maybe a bit strange because sometimes people say that the solution, if you say a solution, it must be feasible. So it's strange to consider no feasible solutions, but well, this terminology basically just says that there are solutions. So this is arbitrary assignment. This is assignment, any assignment of values to the decision variables. Then among these solutions there is a set of feasible solutions. And then the set is split in two parts. In one part we have optimal solutions, and here we have suboptimal.
Давайте все нарисуем. Мы тоже нарисуем.
Now it's possible to have multiple optimal solutions. So for example, a trivial example, if you have a constant objective function, then all feasible solutions are optimal by definition. This class, because as I told you that operations research is a scientific approach for solving decision problems, this class will be mostly focused on the different mathematical techniques, because what scientific approach means some sort of mathematics. There are a lot of techniques which may be considered as part of operations research. Some of them we will touch in the class. Those are linear programming, where the objective and all the constraints are specified, are given by linear functions. Then the integer programming, integer linear programming, which is the linear programming problems where we add requirements of some variables to be integer. Question?
У меня просто линия программирования. Я просто курсовая, это пресекается чуть.
Yeah, but I will not cover the theory. Last year I covered some theory of linear programming. Now I assume that you have some optimization theory classes where you study the theory of linear programming, which is very beautiful theory. But I will mostly focus on the applications where you have some textual formulation of the problem, and then you need to transform this text to a set of linear constraints and the objective function. This is something new. Although, of course, I'm sure there are one or two examples in the programming theory class. So then the network models are the models where you have some network. A network is a synonym to a graph. See much differences, so just in some literature you call it a network, in some literature you call it a graph. Then we will cover the discrete dynamic programming. So I'm not going to spend some of the details now. We'll see later what this thing is. Then we will talk about the inventory modeling. These first four techniques, they are kind of general techniques. They kind of apply to very, very different situations. Inventory modeling is a subfield of operations research which considers a particular business problem, which is a problem of how to manage optimally inventory. So how often you fill it up with some commodities. That types of. So that's basically the main question of how do you support the amount of goods in your inventory. So this is a very important business problem, and there are a lot of. So that's why it's kind of a separate subfield, which you may find as a chapter in almost any operations research textbook. And there are just some special models which were specifically designed for this type of business problems. Then maybe we'll have time to cover the queuing theory. Queuing theory in Russian is theory of mass service, по-русски теория массового обслуживания. So it's a theory which tells you basically if you have some counters, like for example in some fast food restaurant, some McDonald's or Burger King, you have some cashiers. And you have a queue of people.
What is it, cashiers?
Cashier. So you have some queue of people who are being served by different cashiers, cash points, or any else, like when you come to the post office, if you have to come to the post office, so those are the people who serve you at postal service. And then the queuing theory just tells you if you have some performance measures in these servers, say for example the average serving time, and some measures for this queue, for example how at what rate new people arrive to this queue. Then the queuing theory might tell you, well, what is the average waiting time, for example. or average length of the queue in your facility. So again, difference here is that all the previous techniques, including the inventory modeling, they are intended to provide you with the optimal decision, right? So you apply the techniques, they give you immediately the optimal decision. The queuing theory doesn't give you any optimal decision. Instead, the queuing theory tells you, well, just give me some parameters of your queuing system, and I will give you some performance metrics of this queuing system. And then you may say, well, whatever, what if I add another cashier service? Well, how this affect average waiting time? So the queuing theory might answer you on this, might provide answers on these type of questions. And the last topic, the simulation. So in general, simulation means that you kind of simulate some situation many times on the computer and collect some statistics. But here in this course, we will consider simulation mostly for getting these performance measures, but for the situations where the queuing theory cannot give you the closed form answer. So, for example, if you say that the solving time of a different cashier is exponential with some parameter, and this queue is also the average the time between arriving two consequent customers is also exponentially distributed with some other parameters. Much for this moment. Then if you have exponentially distributed waiting serving time here, exponentially distributed arrival time here, then the queuing theory can give you the closed form solution for this, for example, average waiting time. If, for example, you say that, well, this time is not exponential, it's maybe, I don't know, log normal, 10 with some parameters, then the queuing theory doesn't give you the closed form solution for this value, and then you have to apply simulation technique in order to simulate the life of this queuing system for many times, and then you just capture the statistics on waiting time, you get the average, and this is how you get the average waiting time estimate if you consider some queuing systems for which the queuing theory doesn't have closed form solutions. And briefly outline the techniques which are outside of the course. The game theory, well, it used to be outside of the course, but now after the join, the game theory will be the second part of this joint class. So you will study the game theory in much details. And then there are different techniques for multi-criteria optimization. Or in our textbook it's called, I think, goal programming, where you have multiple criteria. Have you encountered multi-criteria problems? I think I think for TGH might have considered. Okay, so basically it's многокритериальная оптимизация. So it's the situation where you have not a single objective function like you had before, but multiple objective functions. So, for example, when you choose a hotel to stay for a while, you might consider different criteria. Price, the distance to the center, and the number of stars. And then you might want, of course, the price to be lowest, the distance to center lowest, and the number of stars highest. And well, if these criteria were independent, then it's just simple, just solve three independent optimization problems, but unfortunately they are tightly dependent. So usually when you have a higher number of stars, the price is usually also higher. So those types of problems requires some specific techniques, which we will not cover in this class. But if you are interested, you may read
Maybe methods like SMART.
smart. What is is this from some business management? Yes.
We have a course, choice course, and
Elective course.
да, курс по выбору. I suppose we have something like multi-criteria optimization.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, then you know. Have you heard Pareto
Yeah.
boundary? The Pareto boundary just will give you generalized concept of optimal solution, multi-objective, multi-criterion optimization problems. Then the next three topics, the calculus of variations, the optimal control, and continuous dynamic programming. Those are the three techniques which are applied to solve infinite dimensional optimization problems. So we already have seen a problem which can be solved by calculus of variations. The optimal control and continuous dynamic programming are also techniques for solving the optimization problems where you have infinite number of decision variables. So we won't, of course, we will not cover them in this course, but while the TDO problem which we've seen looks kind of funny, it's difficult to find any real world applications. But optimal control actually solves some of the control problems, like the problem of optimal control of some robots, of some robot which goes and pictures some area, for example. So there, this robot may be controlled with some continuous, with some functions depending on time. So the acceleration of the robot is a function of time. So sometime you accelerate it more, and sometime you accelerate it less. But this is a function of time. Так, сколько надо закончить?
У нас еще 15 минут. Или больше. Сколько?
Четыре.
Тогда больше. 35. А что 25?
Okay. And here I put to be continued because there are a lot of techniques. So those techniques I outlined here. So for example, game theory, when the game theory was invented, the people who invented game theory didn't consider it as a part of operations research. It was quite the opposite. Like when people started to think of operations research and to apply some scientific approach to real life business problems, then they noted that, well, sometimes the game theory might help us in certain problems. The multi-criteria optimization techniques may be of use for certain business problems. And of course, so for example, for queuing theory, you may, with the same success, say that the probability theory is a part of operations research, but nobody does this. And the queuing theory professionals, they not usually consider them as a part of operations research. They consider queuing theory more like a part of probability theory, let's say. Okay, so in order to apply these techniques, you need to have some mathematical model. Now, in real life, the organizational problems are usually formulated by people who lack mathematical education, so they will not formulate you as a closed form mathematical model. Mostly they will say, well, we have this, this, and this, and we want this to be better, just suggest us how could we get best this activity. And in order to apply these techniques, you need to construct a mathematical model. And you usually do not consider mathematical models of the whole real world, because the real world requires lots of variables to describe it, variables, and the dependencies may be very, very complex. So even if you construct the mathematical model which kind of quite good, predicts the real world, the model might be so complex that it will be of no use for solving some problems. Therefore, you first of all you try to move from this real world to some simpler assumed real world, and you do this by focusing on dominant variables. So it's either a subset of these lots of variables or some aggregation of these lots of variables. And then you try to find some simpler dependencies between these dominant variables. And then when you have constructed this assumed real world, then you may build a mathematical model for this simplified reality. So let's consider an example of this idea. So suppose we have some plastic containers producer. This company consists of 3 departments: the production department, the department which actually has some factory which actually produces the containers, the materials department which provides some materials for this factory here, and sales department which responds for selling the produced products. The company produces its product in batches, meaning that they don't produce one container after another. They just so that's a usual technique for large scale production, when you produce not by one product, but you say we need to produce 1,000 of products, and this is a single indivisible technological process where you produce a certain number of products. And the question which may arise here is, what is the optimal size of the batch? So they may change its size in the beginning, but then they have to live with this batch size for some time. Okay, I think. Okay, if it's not very good, I think this is very small letters. I haven't actually experimented much with the size, but anyway, I will give you the slides so you will be able to read. So this is the scheme of this company. So as I said, there is a production department which takes input from materials department, and then they move the products they produce to the sales department, who actually sell the products. Now, if we add here more details, we may see that in the materials department there might be some inventory. So they may have already some inputs there, and they may get some input materials which are not in inventory from suppliers. So they may ask suppliers to deliver them some of the materials. And the sales department doesn't sell by itself. They distribute it to the distribution centers where those are the places to which customers arrive and buy or not buy the produced goods. And we may try to characterize those parts in terms of different variables. So, for example, the inventory, we may characterize it by available stock of raw materials and storage limitations. So how much of the material we already have, and how much of the material we may have at maximum. Right? So this inventory usually has some storage limitation. In terms of for the suppliers, we may have different delivery schedules for different materials. For the production department, we may have different available machine and labor hours. So in order to produce something, you need to utilize some machines, and machines are operated by people. So this all requires, bless you, so we have to use machines and people in the production, and we have some limitations on the machine time. So there are a limited number of hours every day, so the machine cannot work more than 24 hours a day. And people also cannot work more than 24 hours a day, and usually they prefer to work less. Then we have some in-process inventory. So this is the inventory for the factory from which they take the material immediately to the production. And then maybe some different quality control standards, so that say they produce a batch of 1,000 products, but then they apply their quality control standards and say that 10% is scrap, so they throw it away, and eventually they are left only with 900 products instead of 1,000. For the sales department, there might be sales forecast, so how much they plan to sell. And for distribution centers, there is a capacity of distribution facilities. So again, you don't build infinitely large distribution centers, so have some limitations in terms of storage. There is a question in terms of effectiveness of marketing campaigns, so how well the salespeople in these centers can actually persuade the customers to buy. And of course, there may be competition, so there might be different distribution center who sells a similar product, and the customers may move to compete. Okay, so this all partly builds the real world, so you may just imagine other characteristics of these different parts of the company. And you may imagine that you see already that there are a lot of variables. Some of them are not quite well defined, like for the competition, what is meant by competition formula here. It's a topic for a special, for a particular class in economics, what is a competition. So this is a very complicated real world. What we may limit ourselves to assumed real world, and we notice that when we interested in determining the production order, the batch size, then what is really needed is two variables. The production variable, the production rate, which is kind of the speed at which they produce the goods, which may be, for example, expressed as 500 products per day, or 10,000 products per month, or whatever. And the second variable is the consumption rate. At what rate they manage to sell. And the production rate will be based on these green real world variables. So it is determined by the characteristics of materials department and the characteristics of production department. And the consumption rate is totally defined by the sales part of this scheme. So you just go, you study all these variables here, just collect some data, and then you may say that, well, approximately we sell about a certain number of goods per year. So this will be the single consumption rate, single number. And now when you have built this assumed real world, then you may consider building an inventory model for answering your question, the optimal batch size. And we'll later see that this is a type of model which belongs to the family of economic order quantity models. We will cover these models when we will get to the inventory model in a couple of topics. Sometimes we have to consider different levels of approximations. So for this I use some analogy from physics. Say, for example, you may consider very approximate scheme of the real world, and it may work for some problems. But for some other problems, you might need to consider a more accurate description of the real world. It still will be the simplification, but it will provide a more complex model. And I illustrate this in physics, namely in the second law of motion. So you probably remember from the school the Newton's second law of motion, which tells you that the acceleration is defined by, depends on the mass of a body and the force. So you put certain force, and if the force is fixed, then the body actually accelerates. So you put a fixed force, and the body increases its speed if you put the fixed force. Now this law tends to be incorrect. Maybe this is a surprise. The more correct way to present the second law of motion is the Einstein form of the second law of motion, which first of all introduces here m0, which is the mass at rest, the mass of a body which has zero speed, which stay at rest. So in Einstein's theory, it is assumed that as body gets some speed, its masses changes. In Newton's world, it's fixed. In Einstein's world, it changes as the speed of the moving body increases. So here I put n0. And then we see that another difference is that we have this additional multiplier before the force. Here we have acceleration or speed, the first derivative speed divided by c. The c is speed of light. In Einstein theory, it is assumed that no body can move at the speed higher than the speed of light. So this fraction here is less than 1. So the speed of a body divided by the maximum speed it can have will always be less than 1. So this thing here is less than 1. So this multiplier is less than 1. Except with the exception when this speed is 0, then the multiplier is exactly 1. And the Einstein intuition here basically says that well, if the body has already very, very high speed, and you want to accelerate it, so you want to increase its speed more than it is already, then you have to put more force. Right? So here, if you fix the force, then eventually the acceleration will go down because of this multiplier. So if you want to acceleration be constant, then you have to increase the force. And well, by Newton, we may also notice that if the speeds are very far from the speed of light, then this term here is very close to 1, and it's enough for us to consider the Newton's form of the second law of motion. So we don't need this more complex equation. Of course, you can imagine that this term here, the first derivative squared, and then get to the power of 3 over half, 3 over 2. This is, of course, a much more complicated mathematical model. And if you consider the movements of planets in space, the planets usually don't move at very fast speed compared to the speed of light, so it is enough to consider this Newton's law of motion. If on the contrary you are to model the movement of elementary particles, which moves at the speeds close to the speeds of light, then you have to consider Einstein's law, because if you use Newton's law, then the forecastings from Newton's law will be very different from the experiment, from what you observe in the experiment. And I would like to add this citation attributed to Einstein, that everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simple. So sometimes it will be enough to consider Newton law, some simple models, or by analog you may see that sometimes it is enough to consider linear programming models, but linear programming models may imply some undesirable properties of the model. And so in some situations it may be required to consider something more complicated. For example, talking about linear programming model, maybe it's worth to add integer constraints for linear programming model. This will move us outside of the techniques used for linear programming models. So in order to solve the integer linear programming model, you have to spend more time. But well, sometimes it is necessary to do, otherwise you will be unable to answer some business question. Okay, now I must admit also that not all of the problems not all organizational problems are solved, require solutions with mathematics. So some problems may be actually solved without mathematics. And another specifics is that because the organizational problems they always involve people, so people have some intelligence, they have some emotions. Then when you implement your solution, but the people may behave a bit strange, unpredictable, and you need to take this into account. You need to take into account human psychology when you implement finally the optimal solution that you find. And I would run through 6 case studies which will illustrate those theses which I just mentioned. So there was actually company UPS, United Parcel Service. This is a logistics delivery service, and they implemented some software which produced optimal routes for their trucks. So every day they have some trucks garage, and they have some points, some delivery points in city or in some area, and they need to provide some routes for the trucks to cover those delivery points optimally. Now this may be easily done with the mathematical tools. We will cover those tools. It's based on a channeling salesperson model, if you know this model. But then when they implemented it, so when they started to give these optimal routes to the drivers, they encountered the problem that the drivers were unhappy because they perceived this as if they were replaced by a machine. So before they used their experience, they assumed that they are great at planning the delivery routes, and now some machine tells them how to do it. And the solution the team came to was to place this banner in the computer on top of the itinerary sheet. So they gave this list of how, in what order the drivers must visit the delivery points, and they placed the banner on top of this sheet that beat the computer. So kind of they put it as a challenge, not as a strict requirement for the drivers. The drivers were happier, and actually some did manage to beat the computer. Now, why did they manage to do this? Well, you may expect, you may just think of, say, you run this optimization problem, you develop the optimal route, but then when the driver goes to the city, he may notice that there is a traffic jam, there is some catastrophe on the road, which made it, which created some traffic jam, which was not perceived by the optimization tool. So, if the driver did follow the route suggested by the computer, which didn't perceive this traffic jam, then he would spend much more time compared to his, let's say, local experience. Now, next case study is the Intercontinental Airport in Houston. There was a problem. People complained about long waiting times for the baggage. And the first solution was to hire more baggage handlers. So you just increase the rate at which the baggage is delivered to the baggage collection points. But it didn't solve the problem. People still complained because they still had to wait some time until they get the baggage. And then there was no mathematical solution to move arrival gates farther from baggage receiving points. So people had to spend more time on traveling from arrival gates to the baggage collection points. They maybe even, in terms of mathematics, they maybe actually have to wait more time. But people just didn't perceive this waiting time. So this is more about perception of the waiting. So when your mind is busy with something, you miss that you wait actually for a long time. And if you wait and do nothing, then you get bored very fast and you go and complain about this. And actually, when I remember when I traveled in Europe, in France, and in Amsterdam, I did notice that that basically the arrival gates are pretty far from the baggage claim, so you basically have construction like this. So here you get the planes, the arrival planes, and then you have to do very long way until you get to the baggage collection points. Also, you may have here some passport control, some security, etc. And then eventually when you come to the baggage collection points, then the baggage is already there. Not sure if this works in Russian, which in native I think usually baggage collection point where there is no baggage at all. But in Europe I noticed that usually the baggage is already on the ground, so this moving band is already free of the baggage because it's in preparation for the next plane. So, okay, so I think we have to make a break.
Okay.